everyone. We'd like to welcome all the students, all the lecturers and other guests. And we're very happy you found your way today to our colloquium. And we are very glad to welcome Professor Cornett, our guest speaker from Canada. Professor Cornett is a religious studies lecturer and used to teach at the Universität. He became known for his individual and kind of unorthodox teaching methods, and it's the subject of the documentary Professor Cornett, since when do we divorce a right answer from an honest answer. And now I will give the floor to, oh no, just a word in German. Wir werden filmen, aber es wird nur auf Professor Cornett gezeigt werden. Und falls jemand nicht damit einverstanden ist, dass seine Wortbeiträge zu hören sind, weil zu sehen seid ihr nicht, wäre es super, wenn ihr nachher uns zukommt.
Machen wir.
Genau. Alright. Now it's up to
Well, thank you. I'd like to extend my appreciation to both Marie and Rita. There have been a lot of email exchanges to make this happen, and they persevered. It would have been easy to give up with the logistics. I just flew in this morning from Montreal, Canada. I arrived at 6:35 in the Frankfurt airport, and they did everything to make this possible. Speaking of email, we know that you have busy schedules, and some of you may want to continue the dialogue later. Well, following in the example of Rita and Marie, I invite you to write your name and your email, and I would welcome the opportunity to pursue dialogue with you, albeit by email. I'll be here tomorrow in Leipzig because I'm probably going to sleep 15 hours straight tonight, and I would welcome speaking with you individually tomorrow if you want. The one thing I would say is I am a religious studies scholar and not microbiology. Therefore, would you write large? If you could write your name in big block letters, and especially the email, it's when you have a good conversation with someone and then you want to follow up on that conversation by the email and just one thing you cannot read. And that's the end of the conversation. So we'll pass this around. How many people here have seen Alanis Obamsuan's film, Professor Norman Cornett, online? Well, thank you for taking the time to watch it. All of you can. It's on the National Film Board of Canada website. It's both in English and in French with subtitles if you want to watch it in French. I should tell you that I should tell you about Alanis Obamsuan. She is, without doubt, the foremost native filmmaker in all of Canada. In fact, she was a special guest at the Berlin Film Festival in February of this year. She won the Governor General's Award, and she is an officer in the Order of Canada. Ms. Obamsuan participated in my dialogic approach to education, and when things happened in 2007, she said, "I'd like to make a film about your teaching." And I said, "Fine, go ahead. As long as we respect the principles of my philosophy of education, which are that the creativity requires the individual remain uncensored, unedited, and unplugged." So I said, go ahead and make your film, as long as I never see any of the outtakes during the shoot, and in documentary film, normally the subject sees what's called the final cut. I said, I will not lay my eyes on the final cut. I will not see this film until the world sees it. And at the world premiere, I did not even know the title. It's entirely the work of Alanis Obamsuan, and I was fascinated by what she did. I believe that we have to trust the artist. We must give them carte blanche, a blank slate. Speaking of that, do we have anything to write with? It might be good to have something to write with a little later. And I believe that's what we have to do with students, incidentally, is to encourage their creativity, to give them carte blanche, a blank slate. Well, when we talk about the principles of my dialogic philosophy of education, I should reference, because when you're doing your doctorate, you always have to verify and qualify, and the bibliography has to state it. Where did I get this from, dialogic? I got it, believe it or not, from a literary scholar by the name of Michael Bachten, and his concept of the dialogic imagination. And so for 21 years now, I've been exploring how students their reason and their imagination can dialogue. And I believe that's the key to learning. When we have both the rational and the imaginative. It takes that synthesis, that marriage of all the faculties that we possess as human beings. So that's where the dialogic comes from. Now, another one of my principles in the dialogic philosophy of education is that learning is always a two-way street. It's never a one-way street. It's always in that interstice between student and professor. In fact, I don't even use the word student and professor. I believe we're all learners, and we're on a path towards knowledge, maybe even truth. And we're at different stages in that path. And we learn together. I don't know the word in German. In French, one says cheminer. That we're together going down this path called education. And because I believe it is always a matter of participation, I consider the key to education not the answers, but the questions. In fact, I maintain that there's only one wrong question, and that's the unasked question. So, I invite you now to question me. Uncensored, unedited, unplugged. Please. What questions would you... I don't know if you've ever heard of somebody called Woody Allen. Woody Allen had a film many years ago, everything you always wanted to know about sex, but never dared ask. Now's your time to ask everything you always wanted to know about education, but never ask. So please. Yes, and your name is?
Moritz.
Maurice.
Yes.
No. And you're in education? No, you're religious studies.
Religious history, religions, right? So would you say that the dialogue and the interaction is more important than the actual content that's being taught?
Well, one of the biggest concerns I have is how do we retain the content? What I noticed in the course of my 15 years teaching at one institution, and now I teach at universities throughout Canada, the United States, and also in overseas, as I did in France last year, in the Centre de Recherche Interdisciplinaire in Paris. How do we hold on? How does knowledge and learning, how do the answers stick? I'm not interested in teaching someone for a quiz. I don't want to teach them just for the exam. And I don't want to teach them just for an essay. Maurice, I want to teach them for life. How can we learn and it stay with us for life? I just had the privilege of teaching among the Samson Cree, one of the biggest native peoples of Canada in Alberta. And you know, for native peoples, we talk a lot in academia about theory and praxis, and we're very strong in theory. For native peoples, it's always a matter of What is the final outcome? They're very practical oriented, and I like what I call reality-based education. It must correspond to the reality of the human condition. And here again, I want to recognize my sources. Here, I'm in dialogue with Gabriel Marcel, the French philosopher who's known as the founder of le personnalisme, personalism. Because I believe the only time we really learn is when we take that content and we humanize it, we individualize it, and indeed when we personalize it. Now, I'm mea culpa, I'm telling you my age here, but in the 60s, I was born in 1950, and I'm an American by birth, and raised in California, no less. I went to the University of California, Berkeley, and it's impossible to understand my philosophy of education unless you went to Berkeley in the 60s. Everything was possible. Everything. So I think of education as a field of dreams. If we build it, they will come. And that's what I set out to do. How do we explore all the possibilities of education? And they are limitless. So, what I'm looking for is how we can take the corpus of knowledge and personalize it. I believe that's the key. And why did I mention the 1960s? Well, there was a group called the Fifth Dimension. And they had a song, and one of the lines in that song is, "You gotta feel it." Now, believe it or not, I'm not sure if Fifth Dimension was thinking of John Locke at this time. But John Locke, of course, he's the person who begins with the idea of the tabula rasa, of the blank slate, carte blanche. And he argued that everything we know through sensorial perceptions. So why would we reduce education to just reading? Why don't we include hearing and touching and smelling and feeling? Why don't we use the entire set of skills that we possess as human beings? So I try to look for avenues whereby the student can experiment, live, feel, sense the subject matter. Now, it's a very fancy word in English, and I'm not sure of the equivalent in German, and I do want to publicly acknowledge my shame that I do not speak German. This is, your cultural heritage has been the subject of, just your musicians are enough to keep me going for eternity. And to say nothing of the writers, I apologize for not being able to speak with you in German. It's a remarkable contribution to humanity. Thank you. No, I mean that seriously. So, Britta.
Yeah, I have a question. Why did you change your style of teaching?
Okay, that's a very good question. Now, I'm going to have some Coke, and I mean the liquid kind, just because I got to stay awake here. Why did I change it? You don't change, if something works, you don't try and fix it. I came to the conclusion that the status quo does not work. I knew that I had intelligent students. I knew they were capable students, and when I would speak with them one-on-one, I knew that they could articulate what they thought. But when I would pass out the quiz, or the midterm, or the final, or the exam, to say nothing of the essay, what I call intellectual sclerosis set in. They froze. When I began here about 8 minutes ago now, I said the only wrong question is the unasked question. Why do I take that approach? Because of what I call the fear factor in education. Every single one of us is scared to death to ask a dumb question. Only when we deal with the fear can we get on to what's called cognitive acquisition. We've got to create a welcoming environment, an environment of self-confidence, an environment in which the student trusts themselves instead of being scared. Now, I had the privilege of coming from your train station with a gentleman by the name of Marcel, who I believe is here. Yeah. And Marcel and I were speaking in French. And he was telling me what his experience was like learning French. And he had a teacher, and I think I'm going to use this now wherever I go to different universities. He learned French from a teacher that he is quite sure it was a member of the KGB. But it was the fear factor. If we can get beyond the fear, we can learn. The fear factor is what we must deal with from day one in the university classroom. Why did I change? Because I saw intelligent, articulate, capable people afraid. And you have the word in German, Angst. I saw it in the whole classroom. I said, I have a responsibility. I have a moral responsibility. I have an ethical responsibility. Keep in mind, I'm a religious studies scholar. I must address the angst that I see of the people sitting in front of me. So that's why I changed. I saw that, I'm a product of the system just like everybody else. I spent my entire life in public education and in the university as an adult. So it's not that it's bad, it's that we can do better.
What do you think? Is it fear or is it challenge?
That's a good question. And I like challenges.
Me too.
Did you have a chance yet to see the film? Maybe not. Did you have a chance yet to see Alain Sobansone's film on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the challenge I like to give to people is, and keep in mind I'm teaching 19-year-olds, 20, 21-year-olds primarily at the bachelor's degree. Do you think that you could sit down with the Prime Minister of Canada and really challenge the Prime Minister? And they did. Do you think you could sit down with a Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada and challenge them? And they did. Do you think you could sit down with the Premier of this, you call it, Quebec is not just, Quebec isn't just a province. It aspires to nationhood. Many consider it a nation. When you're the Premier of Quebec, you're different than anybody else in Canada. Are you up to the challenge to sit down and challenge the Premier of Quebec? That's what I believe, that when you challenge the student, they rise to the occasion. Who I saw suffering are the intelligent, because they realize memorizing, learning by heart, regurgitating, repeating. Mice do that. Rats do that in laboratories. I'm not a mouse. I'm not a rat. Give me something that challenges me, that makes me use my mind, and not just repeat, what is this, a loop? Education is in a loop. How do we get them outside the rut, outside the loop? Now, incidentally, I do the same thing with the dialogue partners, whether it be the Prime Minister of Canada. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like for your students to sit down with Angela Merkel? Do you know what you're conveying to those students that you would invite Angela Merkel? You're conveying you believe they are up to the task, that they have what it takes to engage her at a serious level. What we want to communicate as educators is that you have what it takes for the very best. Prime ministers, Supreme Court justices, premiers. I do this incidentally with them when I contacted the Prime Minister. I mean, what is this? I mean, like, what have I got to do? What kind of preparation? What kind of presentation? I said, Prime Minister, you've already done the work, or you wouldn't be Prime Minister. And now I work a lot with musicians, and I have to say, hip hop is a great way of learning. Because I will go up to people like the Premier or the Supreme Court Justice, and I'll ask them, have you got game? Do you want to try something you've never done in your life before? That's a challenge. Let's challenge them. Let's bring them into a space they have never, this is like, what was that program? Star Trek, going into universes that have never been seen before. Let's take them in education beyond what's written in the textbook, where their minds begin to dream dreams of what they can be and what they can do. When you have a 19-year-old, a 20-year-old, I wish I was a medical doctor because they can do so much good. But that wasn't in the cards. I wish I was a Supreme Court Justice because to have the opportunity to set the law right when there's injustice. But that wasn't in the cards for me either. But you know the greatest good you can do to your students? Give them a vision of what they can do, what they can be. And I knew I had students who wanted to be doctors, who wanted to be lawyers, others who wanted to be artists. So mix it up, bring in as many different elements to the curriculum so that the students can find where they fit. And there's not one size fits all. Each of us are different. How do we enable the student to develop their difference into a skill, into knowledge, into a career, more importantly, into a life that makes our world a better place? Well, we need more questions. That was a good one. and I'm a bad, you know how professors are, they just keep talking. Have any of you ever seen a movie called Ferris Bueller's Day Off? If you haven't, it's old now, but there's a teacher in front of the classroom, and a teacher's nightmare is a class that is dead, that doesn't ask any questions, and they're all asleep. One thing I learned very quickly in teaching at university, never teach at 8:30 in the morning. It's a waste of time. But in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, the teacher is trying to get the students to participate. And he says in this droning voice, he asks them a question. Nobody raises their hand. Fortunately, we've got hands raised there. And the teacher says, anyone, anyone, anyone. That's what education is like for a lot of people. Yes, sir?
I've got two questions. First one is, what is the source of the fear you're talking about? Where does it come from? And in addition to that, what's the function of a university? I think both questions get to the same direction.
Well, in the classroom, we have to deal with self-image. That's where the fear comes from. We're always concerned about our self-image. How we appear, how others see us. And inside, one of the areas that I work in, have been working in now for 10 years, I work with a group of specialists that are called transcultural psychiatrists. It's a beautiful field. It's essentially the marriage of anthropology and psychiatry. Because we know that self-image is always culturally informed. Depending on the culture you're in, that will determine how you perceive yourself. So I think the fear entails self-image. The fear also entails the fact that we are animals. So survival is the name of the game. I mean, I was teaching for 15 years at a university where people thought it was the end of their life if they didn't get an A, because they were all going to med school, they were all going to law school, they were all going to grad school. That'll put fear into you if you think you're not going to make what you believe is the summum of life. So those kind of fear, like am I going to make it, will I survive? The bigger question is we have to ask ourselves, what is the reason at the university? And this relates to your second question. I don't believe we're at university to get a job. It's not job training. This is not vocational school. In French you say polytechnique. You know, this is not what we do at university. At university, we're trying to form, to develop, to cultivate, to encourage the human spirit. So that when you leave this classroom, you are an informed citizen of Leipzig and of Germany. And you can make informed decisions because you see the big picture. If in Alanis Begabungsforschung's film, I love hiking. Our whole family hikes all the time. For the first 10 years, we hiked in Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone National Park has grizzly bears. Don't mess with grizzly bears. And the first thing, when you go on a hike where there are grizzly bears, you have to develop what's called peripheral vision, not tunnel vision. And right now what's happening in education is tunnel vision. I'm just seeing what's going to get me a job, in other words, what's going to get me money. But the real purpose of the university, of education, is to develop this peripheral vision whereby we see the big picture. What is the relationship between decisions that politicians are making or that those who take care of cultural events? What is the relationship between, right, I've been following very avidly what happened in France with same-sex marriage. How do I take a position on these issues? That's really what we're here to do. It's to develop the human spirit, not to put that spirit in a box. Yes?
How would you imagine the perfect university then?
Well, perfect, of course, is unattainable. And that's why Thomas More, who invented the word utopie, it means literally in Latin, nowhere. It just doesn't exist. So we've got to be, again, reality-based. For 15 years, I worked in a very traditional institution, and I said, okay, I'm not going to be able to change the entire university, but I can change what happens in my classroom. So I believe that the answer to your question begins with me. I'm not looking elsewhere, I'm looking at what can I do better. As far as a model, I think to the extent that we can develop creativity in the student, whether at the primary, secondary, or post-secondary, i.e. university level, I think that is the crux of the matter. Creativity, ladies and gentlemen, is what distinguishes us from all other species on the planet. I arrived this morning from Canada, and I know there's one animal that you folks all know that comes from Canada, the beaver. Beavers are great engineers, but they always build their dams the same way. Look at the built environment, as architects call it. Look at the built environment of Leipzig. The Jungen steel that I saw, and some of these modern glass structures, and I was on the train past Weimar, where Bauhaus began. Think of Mies van der Rohe, how he reconceptualized a home, an office, a landscape. So how can we nurture creativity? I see that is the crux of the matter. Yes, sir.
Yes, to go deeper in your concept, how can you establish a dialogue with a whole group? So not going the two-way direction only with one person in the room.
Well, this gets back to Britta's question. Why did I change? I noticed over the course of my teaching, whether I had a class of 10 or whether I had a class of 100, never did more than 10% of the students ever raise their hands. So if I'm teaching 50 students, that means I have 5 students. And I can tell you, it's always the same 5. So how do we give a voice to the other 45? In other words, how can they enter into the dialogue? How can they engage? And this is where I get back to literature. But I'm also a professional translator of poems and short stories and novels from French to English. What I would do is I would present them with certain materials, either written materials or recordings, and then we'd actually meet the composer or the musician. They would walk in the room. This is an idea I got from Woody Allen too, but I'll talk about that in just a moment. And I would ask them in a stream of consciousness vein, right there sitting, would you please write everything that goes through your mind as you read this poem, or hear this recording, or see this film, or look at that painting, because we would go to museum, I still do this. I'm returning to Montreal to work with the Montreal International Jazz Festival, and composers and musicians from around the world. This is the reality, the experiential, the sense of Locke. Locke was right. We must experience the curriculum. So let's create as many experiences as possible. And what they would do is, in the privacy of their own minds, they would begin to dialogue, and they would write it all down. And here we have to thank Freud. I mean, his whole notion of the unconscious absolutely changes our understanding of, keep in mind, Freud was a neurologist. We often forget that. We've reduced him to just what postmodernism conceives of Freud. Freud was a scientist, he was a neurologist, and he wanted to find out, okay, we consciously, this goes through our mind, but he discovered that unconsciously so much more was going on. So he wanted to bring up all that's going on in the human mind. And this changes Western culture. Think of James Joyce. Some would say he was the greatest novelist of the 20th century. He wrote a book called Ulysses. It's 825 pages long, ladies and gentlemen. Do you know what Ulysses is about? What goes through one person's mind in 24 hours. And this is because Joyce really understood the implications of what Freud presented. Think of the visual arts. Salvador Dali, the surrealists, when they began to realize that we have visions. What did Merleau-Ponty say? The French philosopher. Every perception is an interpretation. So then you began to explore all these different interpretations. And what happens, to answer your question, sir, is they would write this all down, and the next class, anonymously, without ever saying their names, I would read what the students wrote in dialogue with either the poem, or the novel, or the painting, or the sculpture, or the film, or the recording. And then we would begin to discuss how each of us interpreted it differently. That's where cognitive acquisition comes in. When you validate that individual, that personal understanding of the curriculum, you've made a quantum leap in education. Now, I have to get back to Woody Allen here before I forget this. I work a lot with filmmakers and, believe it or not, with actors as well. Ethan Hawke is one of my dialogue partners, and he's incredible. None of these people make it without blood, sweat, and tears. We think of it as Hollywood. These people work their tails off. You don't make it in the arts without killing yourself. And that's where it's extremely competitive. So, I saw a film called The Purple Rose of Cairo, and it reminded me of education. In The Purple Rose of Cairo, you keep going back over a scene again and again and again, and that's why it reminded me of education. You know, just this loop. But at one point, the people on the screen walk off and they come into the theater. And so I said to myself, as an educator, what if I took the curriculum and it walked into the room? And they could actually talk with those who make history, who make culture, who make politics, who make science. One of the biggest challenges we face, I believe, is establishing a dialogue between the arts and the sciences. This is crucial because scientists have different ways of conceptualizing. And it behooves me to find out how they perceive differently, how they look at their perspective. On the 6th of July, I will lead a dialogic session with V.J. Iyer. V.J. Iyer did his bachelor's in mathematics at Yale University, one of the best in the United States. He finished by 20. Then he wanted to go into the sciences, hard sciences, so he did his master's in physics. Then he wanted to understand the relationship between mathematics, physics, and music, because he was a child prodigy. And so he did his PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, where I studied, on music cognition. Why music cognition? One of the cutting edge fields right now happens to be because in Western society we have aging population, Alzheimer's. How is it that somebody who has Alzheimer's can remember a song?